Hey guys, tonight we begin with the surprisingly complex daily lives of medieval peasants. These weren't just simple farmers toiling in fields. They were skilled craftspeople, community members, and the backbone of medieval society, living lives far more interesting than history books often tell us. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's explore what life was truly like for the ordinary people of the Middle Ages. For medieval peasants, every single day was a balance between survival and community. Their entire existence revolved around the agricultural calendar, the demands of their lords, and the unpredictable forces of nature. A bad harvest could mean starvation for an entire village. A dispute with the local lord could result in losing their land or worse. The stakes were incredibly high. These people had to be resourceful, knowledgeable about their craft, and deeply connected to their community to survive. Understanding their lives helps us appreciate not just medieval history, but the foundations of modern society itself. The rhythms of their days, the structures they built, and the traditions they maintained shaped Europe for centuries to come. Let's start at the very beginning. When we use the word peasant today, it often carries negative connotations. But in medieval times, peasants were simply agricultural workers who made up about 90% of the population. They weren't all the same, though. There were different types of peasants with varying degrees of freedom and wealth. At the bottom were serfs who were bound to the land they worked. They couldn't leave without permission from their lord. Then there were villeins who had a bit more freedom but still owed substantial labor and payments to their lords. At the top of the peasant hierarchy were freemen who owned their own land and had more rights and freedoms regardless of their exact status. All peasants shared one thing in common. Their lives revolved around agriculture. The growing season determined everything. What they ate when they worked, even when they married and had children, everything followed the rhythm of planting and harvest. A typical day for a medieval peasant began before dawn. There were no alarm clocks, of course, but roosters, and the gradually lightening sky served that purpose well enough. In summer, this meant waking around 4 or 5 in the morning. In winter, perhaps a bit later, around 6. The first task of the day was often tending to animals. Most peasant families kept chickens for eggs, perhaps a pig or two, maybe a cow if they were fortunate. These animals needed feeding and care before the family could think about their own breakfast. Breakfast itself was simple, often just bread and ale. Yes, ale. Even children drank weak ale because water was often unsafe. The ale was very weak by modern standards, with low alcohol content. It was simply a safer beverage than water from questionable sources. After this simple meal, the real work began. In spring and summer, this meant working in the fields. Peasants didn't just work their own small plots of land. They also owed labor to their lord's land. This could be 2 or 3 days per week, sometimes more during critical periods like harvest. The work was back-breaking. Plowing was done with wooden plows pulled by oxen, if you were lucky, by hand if you weren't. Sowing seed was done by hand, walking the fields and scattering grain. Weeding was constant. Harvesting meant long days with sickles, cutting grain by hand, bundling it, and hauling it to storage. A typical workday lasted from dawn until dusk, with a brief break for a midday meal. This meal, dinner, was the main meal of the day. It usually consisted of pottage, a thick vegetable stew, along with bread and perhaps some cheese. Let's talk more specifically about the agricultural work that dominated peasant life. The medieval year was divided by the agricultural calendar, and each season brought different tasks and challenges. Spring was the busiest time. This was planting season, and there was a narrow window to get seeds in the ground. Peasants used a 3-field system in many parts of Europe. One field would be planted with winter wheat or rye, another with spring crops like oats or barley, and the third would lie fallow to recover its fertility. Preparing the fields required plowing, which was extraordinarily hard work. A team of oxen could pull a heavy plow, but not all peasants had oxen. Many villages shared oxen between families. If you had no access to oxen, you might plow by hand, pushing and pulling a wooden plow through the soil yourself. Imagine doing this for acres of land. Once the field was plowed, it needed to be harrowed, which meant breaking up the large clods of earth. This was often done by dragging a wooden frame with spikes through the field. Then came sowing, walking the fields with a bag of seed, scattering it in careful, practiced motions. Summer brought different work. The crops needed constant attention. Weeding was crucial. birds and animals needed to be scared away from the growing crops. Children often had this job, standing in fields and making noise to frighten away crows. Summer was also the time for hay making. Grass was cut with scythes, left to dry in the sun, then gathered and stored. This hay would feed animals through the winter. Without enough hay, animals would starve, which could doom a family. Autumn was harvest time, the most critical period of the year. Everything depended on a successful harvest. Grain was cut with sickles, gathered into bundles, and left to dry. Then it was collected and taken to be threshed, which meant beating the grain to separate the edible seeds from the chaff. Winter brought a slight respite from field work, but peasants were never truly idle. This was time for repairs and maintenance. Tools needed fixing. Buildings needed maintaining. Fences required mending. Wood needed to be cut and stored. And there was always spinning and weaving to do. What did medieval peasants actually eat? The diet was simpler than we might imagine, but not necessarily as terrible as popular culture suggests. The foundation of the peasant diet was bread, not the soft white bread we know today, but dense, dark bread made from rye or barley. Wheat was grown, but most of it went to the Lord or was sold at market. Peasants ate the coarser grains. Bread was eaten at every meal. It was also used as a plate. Thick slices of stale bread, called trenchers, would have food piled on top. At the end of the meal, you could eat your plate, now soaked with the juices of your meal. Pottage was the other staple. This was a thick stew made from whatever vegetables were available. Onions, leeks, cabbage, peas, beans. If you were fortunate, you might have a bit of bacon or salt pork to add flavor. The pot would hang over the fire constantly, with ingredients added as available. Some households reportedly kept their pottage pot going for weeks, just adding more ingredients as needed. Meat was rare. Peasants kept animals, but these were too valuable to eat regularly. A pig might be slaughtered once a year, usually in autumn, and the meat preserved with salt. Chickens were kept for eggs, not meat. A cow was far too valuable to kill for food. It provided milk, which could be made into cheese and butter. Fish was more common, especially if you lived near a river or the sea. The church required people to abstain from meat on Fridays and during Lent, but fish was allowed. This made fish important, and many monasteries and villages had fish ponds. Fresh fruit and vegetables were seasonal. In summer, you might have fresh peas, beans, cabbage. Wild berries could be gathered. But in winter, the diet became very monotonous. Stored grain for bread, dried beans and peas, preserved meat if you had it, cheese, and that was about it. The one constant beverage was ale. Water was often unsafe, and everyone, including children, drank weak ale. It was considered a food, not just a beverage. Brewing was typically done by women, and most households brewed their own. Let's step inside a typical peasant home and see what life was really like behind those walls. Most peasant homes were small, simple structures. The poorest might live in a one-room cottage measuring perhaps 12 by 15 feet. That's smaller than many modern bedrooms. In this single room, an entire family would eat, sleep, and live. The walls were typically made using wattle and daub construction. Wattle was woven sticks, like a basket. Daub was a mixture of mud, straw, and dung smeared over the wattle. When it dried, it created a surprisingly sturdy wall. These walls would be whitewashed with lime, giving them a white appearance inside and out. The roof was usually thatch, made from straw or reeds. A good thatch roof, properly maintained, could last 20 or 30 years and was surprisingly waterproof. However, it did require regular maintenance and was vulnerable to fire. The floor was simply packed earth. Wealthier peasants might have flagstones. To make the earthen floor more comfortable and clean, it would be covered with rushes or straw. These would be changed periodically, though perhaps not as often as we might like. In the center of the room was the hearth, the fire pit where all cooking happened. There was often no chimney, just a hole in the roof to let smoke escape. This meant the interior of peasant homes was constantly smoky. This smoke did have one benefit. It helped preserve the thatch roof and kept down insects. Furniture was minimal. Perhaps a table, a few stools or benches. Beds were a luxury. Most people slept on straw mattresses on the floor. The whole family often slept together in one area, both for warmth and because there simply wasn't space for separate sleeping areas. Privacy, as we understand it, didn't exist. With multiple generations living in one or two rooms, everyone was constantly in in each other's presence. Children grew up never being alone. Adults had no private space. This probably shaped medieval psychology in ways we can barely imagine. Lighting was a problem. Candles were expensive. Most peasants used rushlights, which were rushes dipped in animal fat. These gave weak, flickering light and needed constant tending. Most activities that required good light had to be done during daylight hours. Heating was just the central hearth. In winter, homes must have been bitterly cold. People wore most of their clothes to bed. Animals might be brought inside for their body heat. Multiple family members sleeping together was partly for warmth. What did medieval peasants wear, and how did they maintain their appearance? Clothing was simple, practical, and expensive relative to income. Most peasants owned only 2 sets of clothes, one for work and one for church on Sundays. Making cloth was time-consuming, so clothes were precious. For men, the basic outfit was a tunic, essentially a long shirt that reached to the knees. Under this, they wore simple linen undergarments. Over the tunic, they might wear a belt. On their legs, they wore hose, which were like stockings, but made from cloth cut on the bias to stretch slightly. In cold weather, men would add a cloak or hooded coat. Shoes were often simple leather pieces tied around the foot, or wooden clogs. Many peasants simply went barefoot in summer to preserve their shoes. Women wore a similar basic tunic called a kirtle, but longer, reaching to the ankles. Over this, they might wear an apron for work. On their heads, they wore a wimple or kerchief. Married women were expected to cover their hair in public. The color of peasant clothing was generally natural wool tones, browns, grays, off-whites. Dyes were expensive. The wealthy could afford bright colors like red or blue, but peasants stuck to undyed cloth. However, plant dyes could produce yellows, greens, and browns cheaply, so peasant clothing wasn't necessarily all gray and brown. As for cleanliness, standards were different from today, but not non-existent. Peasants did wash, though perhaps not as frequently as we do. They had no soap as we know it, but used various substances for cleaning. Wood ash mixed with water created a basic lye solution that could clean skin and cloth. Bathing was done in a wooden tub filled with heated water. This was a lot of work, so full baths were infrequent, but peasants would wash their face, hands, and feet regularly. Rivers and streams also provided bathing opportunities in warm weather. Hair care was simpler. Men typically kept their hair short for practicality. Women wore their hair long, but kept it covered. Lice were a constant problem for all levels of society. Combing to remove lice was a regular activity. Now let's talk about the social structure that governed peasant life. This is where things get interesting, because medieval society was far more complex than we often assume. The feudal system was the framework of medieval society. At the top was the king, who in theory owned all land. He granted land to nobles in exchange for military service and loyalty. These nobles were lords, who then granted portions of their land to peasants in exchange for labor, and a portion of the harvest for peasants. This meant they didn't own their land. They held it from their lord in exchange for specific obligations. These obligations varied by region and time period, but typically included several requirements. First, there was labor service. Peasants had to work on the lord's land for a certain number of days per week. During planting and harvest, this might increase. This was called corvée labor. Imagine you have your own fields that need work, but you must spend several days each week working your lord's fields first. Second, there were rents and fees. Even though they were paying through labor, peasants also owed rents, typically paid in produce. A portion of everything they grew went to the Lord. 1/10 might go to the church as tithe. Another significant portion went to the Lord as rent. Third, there were various fees and taxes. Want to grind your grain? You must use the Lord's mill and pay a fee. Want to bake your bread? The Lord's oven with another fee. Getting married, that's a fee. Inheriting land, another fee. These fees were called banalities, and they were deeply resented. Fourth, there were legal restrictions. Serfs couldn't leave the manor without permission. They couldn't marry without the Lord's approval. They had to attend the Lord's court for legal matters. Their freedom of movement and choice was severely restricted. However, this wasn't slavery. Serfs had rights too. They couldn't be evicted from their land as long as they met their obligations. They could pass their holding to their children. They could accumulate property and wealth within limits. The relationship between lord and peasant was reciprocal, at least in theory. The lord provided protection, maintained order, organized the community's resources. In times of war or famine, a good lord would help his peasants. Of course, in practice, many lords were exploitative and cruel. Peasants also had their own internal hierarchy. The village reeve was a peasant chosen to supervise the other peasants and organize labor on the lord's land. This was a position of responsibility, but also made you unpopular since you had to enforce the lord's demands. Then there were skilled craftsmen within the peasant class. The blacksmith was crucial, making and repairing tools. The miller ground grain. The baker operated the communal oven. These specialists had more status and often more wealth than ordinary field workers. Village life had its own governance too. Many villages had common fields managed collectively. Decisions about when to plant, when to harvest, which fields to leave fallow. These were made by the village community. They would meet in the manor court or village assembly to make these decisions. This communal decision-making was important. Medieval peasants weren't just passive laborers following orders. They had systems of self-governance and collective action. If a lord became too oppressive, villagers might resist, either passively or actively. Let's turn now to family life. How did medieval peasants experience family, marriage, and relationships? Marriage for peasants was both a romantic and an economic arrangement. Young people did have some choice in whom they married, more than you might expect. However, practical considerations were paramount. Marriage was about creating a viable household economic unit. Peasant marriages typically happened in the early 20s for both men and women. This was later than nobility, who often married in their teens. The reason was practical. Peasants needed to accumulate resources and establish themselves before they could support a family. Courtship was relatively informal. Young people met at village gatherings, church, festivals, and while working. There was some opportunity for young people to socialize and choose partners, though always under the watchful eyes of the community. Once a couple decided to marry, there were negotiations between families. What each would bring to the marriage, what resources would be pooled. For serfs, the lord's permission was required, and often a fee had to be paid. The wedding itself was simpler than modern ceremonies. It began at the church door with public vows witnessed by the community. This public nature was important because it established the legitimacy of the union. Then there would be a celebration, though the scale depended on the family's means. Marriage created a household partnership. Both husband and wife had essential roles. The man typically handled field work, while the woman managed the household, including brewing, baking, gardening, and textile production. But these divisions weren't absolute. During harvest, everyone worked in the fields, and men might help with household tasks. Children typically arrived soon after marriage. Infant mortality was high, so families needed many children to ensure some survived to adulthood. A typical peasant family might have 5 or 6 children, though 2 or 3 might die in infancy. Childhood was short. By age 6 or 7, children were expected to help with work appropriate to their age. Young children might watch younger siblings gather firewood or tend geese. By their early teens, they were doing adult work. Parenting styles were different from today. There was affection, certainly, but also a practical acceptance of high child mortality. Parents couldn't afford to become too attached to infants who might not survive. This seems harsh to us, but it was a psychological necessity. Childhood play did exist. Children made simple toys and played games we'd recognize, versions of tag, dolls made from scraps, balls made from tied rags. But play was balanced with work from an early age. Education for peasant children was minimal. Most never learned to read. Knowledge was passed down orally, stories, songs, practical skills. A fortunate peasant child might be taught by the village priest to read Latin, so they could become a cleric, one path of upward mobility. Family dynamics were complex. The nuclear family was the base unit, but extended family was important too. Elderly parents might live with adult children. Orphaned cousins might be taken in. The household could be quite fluid, expanding and contracting based on need and circumstance. Women's lives were particularly constrained. They were legally subordinate to their fathers, then their husbands. They couldn't own property in most places. Yet, within the household and community, they had significant practical power and respect. A capable housewife was essential to family survival. Death was a constant presence. Life expectancy for a peasant was perhaps 30 to 40 years, though if you survived childhood, you might live into your 50s. Everyone had lost family members. Funerals were community events, important for communal grieving and social cohesion. Remarriage after a spouse's death was common and practical. Widows and widowers needed partners to maintain their households. A widow with land was often quick to remarry, sometimes within months. This wasn't callousness, but economic necessity. Now let's delve deeper into the farming techniques that sustained medieval society. Agriculture was the foundation of everything, and medieval farmers were actually quite sophisticated in their methods. The three-field system was revolutionary for its time. Instead of dividing land into two fields, with one left fallow, three-field rotation was more efficient. One field would be planted with winter crops like wheat or rye, planted in autumn and harvested in summer. A second field would be planted with spring crops like oats, barley, or legumes, planted in spring and harvested in autumn. The third field would lie fallow, giving it time to recover. This system had several advantages. It increased the amount of land under cultivation at any time. It spread the labor more evenly through the year. It reduced the risk of total crop failure. And planting legumes actually improved soil fertility by fixing nitrogen. But let's talk about the actual techniques of farming. Plowing was the first crucial step. The medieval heavy plow was a significant innovation. Unlike the simple scratch plows of earlier times, the heavy plow had a mold board that turned the soil over. This was essential for the heavy clay soils of northern Europe. These plows required significant pulling power, usually a team of 6 to 8 oxen. This is why oxen were so valuable and why villages often shared them. The peasants would take turns using the village plow team. Plowing wasn't just dragging a plow through the soil. The plowman had to keep the furrows straight and maintain the right depth. It was skilled work. Boys learned by watching and helping from a young age. After plowing came harrowing. A harrow was a frame with spikes or discs that was dragged across the plowed field to break up large clods of earth and create a finer seed bed. This might be done multiple times to get the soil just right. Sowing was done by hand, a technique called broadcasting. The sower walked the field with a bag of seed, rhythmically scattering handfuls of grain. Getting even distribution required practice and skill. Uneven sowing meant uneven growth and lower yields. After sowing, the field needed attention. Birds were a constant problem. Children and old people who couldn't do heavy field work would be stationed in fields to scare away birds. They might use noisemakers, throw stones, or simply shout and wave their arms. Weeding was essential but backbreaking. Peasants would walk their fields, pulling weeds by hand or hoeing them out. A weedy field meant reduced yields, so this couldn't be neglected. Entire families would work together, moving across the field in lines, pulling weeds. The growing season required vigilance. Peasants watched their crops carefully, looking for signs of disease or pest problems. There wasn't much they could do about these issues with medieval technology, but early identification might allow some response. Harvest was the culmination of the year's work. For grain crops, this meant cutting with sickles. A sickle is a curved blade with a handle. The harvester would grasp a bunch of grain stalks with one hand and cut through them with a sickle in the other hand. This cut grain was then laid on the ground. Once cut, grain was gathered into bundles called sheaves, tied with twisted straw. These sheaves were stood upright in groups called stooks to allow air circulation for drying. After drying, the sheaves were collected and taken to a barn for storage and thrashing. Thrashing separated the grain from the stalks and chaff. This was done by beating the grain with flails, wooden tools designed for the purpose. The grain was then winnowed, tossed into the air so the wind would blow away the lighter chaff while the heavier grain fell back down. This left clean grain ready for storage or milling. All these steps were labor-intensive. Harvest required all hands, men, women, children, young and old. It was a race against time and weather. Grain left too long in the field might be destroyed by rain or wind. A successful harvest was celebrated because it meant survival for another year. Medieval farmers also understood the importance of manure for soil fertility. Animal manure was carefully collected and spread on fields. In fact, one reason animals were brought into barns in winter was to collect their manure. The value of manure meant that peasants with more animals had a significant advantage. Crop yields were much lower than today. A typical yield might be 4 bushels harvested for every bushel planted. Modern agriculture might achieve 50 to 1 or higher. But for medieval farmers, achieving that 4 to 1 ratio required skill, hard work, and favorable weather. Weather was the great unknown. Too much rain, too little rain, late frosts, early frosts, hailstorms, all could destroy a crop. Medieval farmers had no control over weather and limited ability to predict it. They relied on traditional weather lore and prayers to their patron saints. The agricultural calendar structured the entire year. Plowing in spring, sowing, watching the growing crops through summer, hay making in June and July, grain harvest in August, autumn plowing and planting of winter crops, slaughtering animals in autumn. Then the relative rest of winter before the cycle began again. This rhythm had been followed for generations and would continue for generations more. It gave structure and meaning to life. Everyone knew their place in this cycle and what needed to be done when. Let's explore how life changed with the seasons in a medieval village. The passage of seasons wasn't just about weather. It fundamentally altered the entire structure of daily life. Spring arrived with hope and anxiety. Hope because the earth was coming back to life. Anxiety because food stores were running low. Late winter and early spring were the hungry times. This was when last year's harvest was almost gone, and this year's crops were just being planted. March and April were plowing and planting time. The urgency was intense. There was a narrow window when soil conditions were right. Not too wet, not too dry, not too cold. Miss that window and the crop would fail. Every able person was in the fields from dawn to dusk. Spring also brought maintenance work. Fences damaged by winter weather needed repair. Buildings needed fixing. Tools needed replacing or mending. The blacksmith was busiest in spring, making and repairing the plows, sickles, and other tools that would be needed in the coming months. As the weather warmed, diet improved slightly. Fresh greens could be gathered from hedgerows and fields. Nettles, for instance, were collected and cooked. The first vegetables from gardens appeared. After months of stored grain, dried beans, and preserved meat, any fresh food was welcome. Spring was also when animals gave birth. Cows calved, ewes lambed, sows farrowed. These newborn animals represented wealth and hope for the future. They also required care and attention. watching to ensure they thrived. Church festivals marked the spring season. Easter was the biggest celebration, marking the resurrection of Christ. For peasants, it also marked the end of Lenten fasting restrictions. Easter meant fresh eggs, perhaps some fresh meat if they were fortunate. It was a time of celebration after the privations of winter and Lent. Summer brought its own rhythm. June was hay-making time. Grass in meadows was cut with scythes, left to dry in the sun, then gathered and stored. This hay would feed animals through the next winter. It was crucial work that couldn't be delayed. July and August were growing time for crops. The grain was ripening in the fields. Peasants watched anxiously for any sign of problems. A hailstorm could destroy everything. Too much rain could cause rot. Too little rain could mean stunted crops. Summer evenings were longer, which meant more time for work, but also more time for socializing. After the day's work, villagers might gather to talk, tell stories, sing songs. Young people had opportunities to socialize and court under the long twilight. Midsummer festivals broke up the work routine. The feast of St. John in late June was celebrated with bonfires and festivities. These pagan-rooted celebrations had been Christianized, but retained their ancient character. Dancing, games, drinking, and merriment marked the summer solstice. Harvest began in August and could extend into September. This was the most critical time of year. Everything depended on successfully bringing in the harvest. Every person who could work was in the fields. Days were long. Work was exhausting, but it had to be done. Harvest was also a time of community cooperation. Neighbors helped each other bring in crops. The Lord's crops had to be harvested first, with all villagers contributing labor. Then families could focus on their own harvest. As each field was completed, there would be a small celebration. The last sheaf of grain might be fashioned into a corn dolly, a figure made from woven grain stalks. This represented the spirit of the harvest and was kept until the next planting as a good luck charm. The harvest festival, often called Lammas in England, celebrated the completion of harvest. This was a time of relief and celebration. Food was relatively plentiful. The community had successfully survived another year. There was feasting, drinking, games, and Thanksgiving. Autumn was a time of preparation. The harvest was safely stored, but there was much to do before winter. Autumn plowing and planting of winter wheat or rye needed to be completed. Animals had to be dealt with. Late autumn, around November, was killing time. Animals that couldn't be fed through winter were slaughtered. Some meat would be salted or smoked for preservation. Fresh meat was briefly plentiful, a last period of plenty before winter set in. This was also when rents and tithes were paid. The Lord collected his share of the harvest. The church collected its tithe. After these obligations were met, what remained was the family's supply for the coming year. It had to last until next harvest, months away. November 1st, All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day marked the beginning of the dark season. The veil between living and dead was thought to be thin. These festivals honored ancestors and the recently departed. They marked the transition from the light half of the year to the dark half. Winter brought a slower pace. Field work was minimal. Animals were mostly kept inside, in barns, or even in the house for their body heat and protection. Daily tasks became focused on maintenance, repairs, and indoor work. Winter was time for textile production. Women spent much time spinning wool into thread and weaving cloth. This was essential work, producing the fabric for clothing and household needs. The whole family might be involved, children carding wool, women spinning, men weaving on the larger looms. Men did woodwork in winter, making and repairing tools, creating household items, cutting and storing firewood. These tasks could be done inside or in workshops, protected from the worst weather. Food in winter was monotonous. Stored grain made into bread and porridge, dried beans and peas. Whatever meat had been preserved. Cheese if they had made it. The diet lacked variety and fresh vegetables. This is when malnutrition was most common. Christmas broke the winter monotony. December 25th through January 6th was a time of celebration, feasting, and rest. The church mandated rest from labor. Lords traditionally gave their peasants some sort of feast or gift. It was a bright spot in the dark winter. Winter was also dangerous. Cold could kill. Illness spread easily when people were crowded inside. Food shortages could become critical by late winter. This was when the weak, the old, and the very young were most at risk. But winter also brought its own beauty. Snow transformed the landscape. Ice on ponds and streams allowed skating, a rare form of recreation. Indoor gatherings around the fire meant time for storytelling, games, and community bonding. By February, the cycle was beginning again. Candlemas on February 2nd marked the halfway point of winter. Preparations for spring planting began. Tools were checked and repaired. Seeds were sorted and stored. Plans were made for the coming year. The seasonal cycle was deeply embedded in peasant consciousness. It structured time, dictated activities, and gave life its rhythm. Seasons weren't just weather patterns. They were the framework of existence, the heartbeat of medieval life. Now let's examine the structure of a typical medieval village. These weren't just random collections of houses. They had organization, hierarchy, and purpose. A typical village might have 50 to 100 inhabitants, living in perhaps 20 to 30 households. Size varied widely, but this was common. Large enough to provide a labor force and community, small enough that everyone knew everyone else. The physical layout of villages varied by region, but many had common features. Often there was a central area, a village green or common. This open space served multiple purposes: communal meetings, markets, festivals, and as grazing land for animals. Around this central space were the peasant houses. These might be arranged in a rough circle or along a main path. Each house had a small plot of land attached for a garden, and perhaps a pigsty or chicken coop. The Lord's Manor House was usually the largest and best building in the village. It might be made of stone, while peasant houses were wood and wattle. It represented power and authority, a constant reminder of the social hierarchy. The church was another central building. Even small villages had churches, often made of stone. The church wasn't just for worship. It was the center of community life, where announcements were made, records were kept, and the community gathered. The village mill was essential infrastructure. Mills were expensive to build and maintain, so they were usually owned by the lord. Peasants had to use the lord's mill to grind their grain and pay a fee for the service. This monopoly was resented but unavoidable. Some villages had a communal oven. Like the mill, this was often owned by the lord and required payment to use. Peasant homes rarely had ovens, just open hearths for cooking, for baking bread. You needed a proper oven, and using the communal one was more efficient than everyone building their own anyway. The blacksmith's forge was crucial. The blacksmith made and repaired metal tools, shod horses, and performed other metalwork. This was skilled work, and the blacksmith was an important and respected community member. Villages were surrounded by fields. These weren't enclosed individual farms like we picture today. Instead, they were open fields divided into strips. Each peasant family had strips scattered throughout the different fields. This might seem inefficient, but it distributed risk and ensured everyone had access to both good and poor land. Beyond the arable fields were meadows for hay production, common pastures where villagers could graze their animals, and often areas of woodland or waste ground. These commons were important for gathering firewood, foraging, and grazing animals. The whole village territory, from the houses to the furthest fields, was the manor. This was both a geographic and a social-economic unit. The manor was the domain of the lord, who controlled land use, held courts, and collected rents and fees. Village government was partly imposed from above and partly developed from below. The lord appointed a bailiff or steward to manage his interests. This official oversaw the manor, collected rents, and supervised labor. But villages also had their own informal governance. The village elders, typically older, more prosperous peasants, had influence. The reeve, usually elected by peasants, but confirmed by the lord, organized communal labor and represented peasants to the lord. The manor court was where governance happened. This court met regularly to deal with disputes between peasants, enforce regulations, and administer the lord's justice. Serious crimes went to higher courts, but most everyday matters were handled here. Village regulations covered many aspects of life: when to plant and harvest on the common fields, how many animals each household could graze on the commons, maintenance of roads and bridges. These were all decided collectively and enforced by the manor court. Community solidarity was essential. Peasants depended on each other for survival. Barn raisings, harvest help, care for the sick. These were all community obligations. Someone who refused to contribute would find themselves ostracized. But villages also had tensions and conflicts. Disputes over boundaries, accusations of theft, disagreements over shared resources, these were common. The manor court spent much time adjudicating these conflicts. Villages weren't isolated. They existed within a larger network. Nearby villages were rivals, but also trading partners. People married outside their own village, creating family connections across the region. Traveling peddlers brought news and goods from afar. Markets provided connection to the wider world. Most villages held small markets, perhaps once a week or once a month. Larger market towns, a few hours' walk away, had bigger markets where peasants could sell surplus and buy necessities. Fairs were special events, often held once or twice a year. These were much larger than regular markets, attracting merchants from far away. Fairs offered goods not available locally: spices, fine cloth, metal goods. They were also social occasions with entertainment, drinking, and celebration. The village church connected the community to the larger Christian world. The priest said Mass in Latin, the universal language of the church. Holy days and feast days were celebrated according to the church calendar, the same in every Christian village. This created a sense of belonging to something larger than just the local community. Monasteries and convents were also part of the landscape. These religious communities often owned large estates worked by peasants. Monks and nuns served spiritual and educational roles, but were also major landowners and economic forces. Some peasants left their villages permanently. Younger sons with no prospects might seek their fortune elsewhere. Villages near growing towns provided opportunity for migration. Freedom in a town for a year and a day could liberate a serf from bondage. But for most peasants, the village was their entire world. They were born there, lived their whole lives within a few miles, and were buried in the village churchyard. Their horizons were limited, but their connection to place was deep. Let's take a deeper look at the feudal system that structured medieval society. This system determined almost every aspect of a peasant's life, so understanding it is crucial. Feudalism was based on a hierarchy of obligations. Everyone had duties to those above them and responsibilities to those below. At least, that was the theory. In practice, it was complex and varied. At the very top was the king. In theory, king owned all land in the kingdom. He was God's appointed ruler, chosen by divine right. But the king couldn't manage all this land himself. He needed support and loyalty from powerful nobles. So the king granted large estates to his most important supporters, dukes, earls, and other great lords. In exchange, these nobles swore fealty to the king and promised to provide military service. When the king called, they had to come with a specified number of knights and soldiers. These great lords couldn't manage all their land either. They granted portions of it to lesser nobles, barons, knights, and gentlemen. These lesser nobles also swore fealty and owed military service, but to their immediate lord rather than directly to the king. At the bottom of this hierarchy were the peasants. They held land from their lord in exchange for labor and payment. Unlike the nobles above them, peasants didn't owe military service. They owed work. This system is called feudalism, from the Latin word feudum, meaning an estate or land granted in return for service. Each level of the hierarchy was bound to the next by obligations that went both ways. Lords owed protection and justice to their vassals. Vassals owed service and loyalty to their lords. For peasants, this meant their lord was supposed to protect them from attack, provide justice through his court, and help in times of crisis. In exchange, peasants owed labor on the lord's land, payment of rents and fees, and obedience. The reality was often less fair than the theory. Lords could be exploitative, increasing fees and labor demands. Peasants had limited recourse if their lord was unjust. They couldn't simply leave, especially serfs who were bound to the land. Let's look at the specific obligations a serf might have. A typical serf household might owe 3 days per week of labor on the lord's land. During harvest, this might increase to 6 days per week, leaving almost no time for their own fields. In addition to labor, serfs owed various payments. At harvest, they might owe a portion of their crop to the lord. This could be 1/10 or even 1/3 of what they grew. They also owed a separate 1/10 to the church as tithe. Then there were fees for using the Lord's facilities. Want to grind grain? Pay the mill fee. Want to bake bread? Pay the oven fee. These fees, called banalities, were mandatory. You weren't allowed to grind grain elsewhere or bake at home if the Lord provided a mill and oven. marriage required the Lord's permission for serfs, and often a fee called merchant. When a serf died, their best animal, or sometimes best possession, went to the Lord as a heriot, a death duty. The heir also had to pay a relief, essentially a fee to inherit. These obligations could be crushing. A peasant family might keep only a third to half of what they produced. The rest went to the Lord, the church, and various fees. This left little surplus, making survival precarious. However, peasants did have some rights. A serf couldn't be evicted as long as they met their obligations. The land they held was hereditary, passing to their children. They could accumulate personal property. They had access to the manor court for justice in disputes with other peasants. The Lord's court, or manor court, was where much of the business of feudalism happened. This court met regularly, sometimes monthly. It handled disputes between peasants, enforced regulations, witnessed land transfers, and recorded important agreements. The manor court was also where the Lord's demands were communicated to peasants. Changes to labor obligations, new fees, regulations about land use. These would be announced in court. Peasants had to attend these courts. Failure to appear could result in fines. Not all peasants were serfs. There were gradations of freedom. Villeins had slightly more freedom than serfs, but still owed substantial obligations. Cottagers held only a small cottage and perhaps an acre or two, owing less labor but having less security. At the top of the peasant hierarchy were freemen. These peasants owned their land outright or held it for fixed rents. They didn't owe labor service. They had more rights and could come and go as they pleased. However, even freemen were subject to the Lord's authority in many ways. The distinction between these categories could blur. A serf family that prospered might effectively buy their freedom through payments. A freeman who fell into debt might lose their land and sink into serfdom. Social mobility was limited, but not impossible. Lords varied greatly in how they treated their peasants. Some were harsh and exploitative, constantly demanding more. Others were relatively benevolent, recognizing that prosperous peasants meant more secure income for them. The relationship between lord and peasants was complex, varying by personality and circumstance. Monasteries and convents were major landowners, and peasants on monastic estates might be better or worse off than those under secular lords. Monasteries kept better records, which helps historians, but might also mean more efficient extraction of rents and labor. The church itself was a feudal lord, owning vast estates. Bishops and abbots were often as much feudal magnates as spiritual leaders. They participated in the same system of obligations and service as secular nobles. Women's place in feudalism was complex. Noblewomen could inherit estates and exercise lordship in their own right if they had no brothers. But peasant women were legally subordinate, covered by their father's or husband's rights. Yet they performed essential labor and participated in manor courts regarding matters that affected them. Children were considered part of the household unit. A peasant's children owed the same obligations as their parents. When the head of household died, the heir inherited not just the land, but also the obligations attached to it. The feudal system was theoretically rigid, but practically flexible. Lords and peasants negotiated constantly. Labor obligations might be commuted to cash payments. Services might be traded or adjusted based on changing circumstances. The system was more dynamic than often portrayed. By the later Middle Ages, feudalism was beginning to break down. The Black Death in the 14th century killed so many people that labor became scarce and valuable. Peasants had more bargaining power. Some places saw peasant revolts demanding better terms. Money was becoming more important than labor service. But for most of the medieval period, feudalism structured society. It determined where you could live, what work you did, who you could marry, and how much of what you produced was yours to keep. Understanding feudalism is essential to understanding medieval peasant life. Now let's explore what childhood was like for medieval peasants. This is a topic where modern perspectives can mislead us. Medieval childhood was fundamentally different from our experience. First, we must understand that childhood, as we conceive it, didn't really exist in the Middle Ages. There wasn't a protected period of life devoted to play and learning. Children were seen as small adults who would gradually take on adult responsibilities. Infancy lasted longer than it does today. Babies were usually nursed for 2 or even 3 years. This prolonged breastfeeding served multiple purposes. It provided nutrition, of course, but also helped space pregnancies. Nursing suppresses fertility, though not reliably. Infant mortality was horrifically high. Perhaps 1/3 of children died before their first birthday. Another third might die before age 5. Diseases that we prevent with vaccines or treat with antibiotics were death sentences: measles, whooping cough, dysentery, various fevers. This high mortality shaped how parents viewed children. There was love, certainly, but also a protective, emotional distance. Parents couldn't allow themselves to become too attached to babies who might not survive. This seems cold to us, but was psychologically necessary. Babies were swaddled tightly, wrapped in cloth strips that restricted movement. This was thought to help their limbs grow straight and keep them safe. Swaddled babies could be hung on a peg while parents worked, which was practical if somewhat horrifying by modern standards. Childbirth itself was dangerous for both mother and child. Women gave birth at home, attended by female relatives and perhaps a midwife. There was no pain relief, no medical intervention if something went wrong. Maternal mortality was high. Many women died in childbirth or from complications afterward. If a child survived infancy, they entered early childhood, perhaps ages 2 to 7. This was a time of increasing independence. Toddlers were watched by older siblings or allowed to play near where adults worked. They wore simple gowns, both boys and girls, until age 6 or 7. Play did happen. Children made simple toys from whatever was at hand: dolls from cloth scraps, balls from tied rags, hobby horses from sticks. They played games that we'd recognize, versions of tag, hide and seek, simple ball games. But play was balanced with gradually increasing work responsibilities. By age 5 or 6, children were expected to help with simple tasks: collecting eggs from chickens, gathering firewood, watching younger siblings, scaring birds from fields. These were all jobs young children could do. Work was seen as natural and educational, teaching skills they'd need as adults. Age 7 was a turning point. This was when boys stopped wearing gowns and began wearing tunics like men. It was also when more serious work began. 7-year-olds might help with plowing, carrying water to workers in fields, or learning a trade if they were apprenticed. For peasant children, formal education was rare. Most never learned to read or write. Knowledge was passed down orally and through practice. A boy learned farming by working alongside his father. A girl learned household management from her mother. However, the church did provide some educational opportunity. Bright peasant boys might be taught by the village priest to read Latin. If they showed aptitude, they might be sent to a monastery school or even to study for the priesthood. This was one of the very few paths of upward mobility available to peasants. Girls received even less formal education. The assumption was that they would marry and manage households. They learned spinning, weaving, brewing, baking, gardening, and childcare. These were essential skills taught by mothers and other women in the community. Childhood was shorter in another sense too. Puberty and adolescence, as we understand them, didn't exist as separate life stages. You were a child, and then you were an adult. The transition happened around age 12 to 14 for boys, slightly younger for girls. At this age, peasant children were doing adult work. Boys were plowing fields. Girls were managing significant household responsibilities. Many children left home at this age, going to work as servants in other households or being apprenticed to learn a trade. Child labor wasn't seen as exploitative. It was normal and expected. Children needed to contribute to household economy. They were also learning the skills they'd need as adults. A boy who didn't learn farming couldn't survive as an adult peasant. A girl who couldn't spin and weave would be unmarriageable. Discipline was strict by modern standards. Corporal punishment was normal. Children were expected to be obedient and respectful. The Bible verse, "Spare the rod and spoil the child," was taken seriously. However, there's also evidence of affection and play. Medieval parents weren't monsters, just people of their time. Children experienced loss frequently. As we discussed, many siblings died. Grandparents, if they lived to old age, probably died when the child was young. Aunts, uncles, cousins, neighbors, all might die from disease, accident, or childbirth. Children grew up familiar with death in a way modern children are protected from. Religious education began young. Children learned prayers and attended church. The major church festivals were highlights of the year for children as well as adults. Saints' feast days might involve special foods or activities. Christmas was magical, even for poor peasant children. Children participated in community life. They attended church, went to festivals, witnessed manor court proceedings. There wasn't a separate children's world. Children saw and experienced everything adults did, gradually learning their place in society. Clothing for children was simply smaller versions of adult clothing. There wasn't special children's clothing. When a child outgrew something, it was passed to the next younger child and patched and mended as needed. Diet for children was similar to adults, though perhaps with more attention to providing milk and softer foods for very young ones. Children might get slightly better food if it was available, but in times of scarcity, everyone suffered equally. Games and toys, as mentioned, did exist, but were simple. Hoops to roll with sticks, spinning tops, small carved figures. These were typical toys. Many games required no equipment. Singing games, clapping games, games of tag and chase. Fairy tales and folk stories were part of childhood. These weren't written down, but passed orally. Parents and grandparents told stories, tales of brave knights, cunning peasants, magical creatures, and moral lessons. These stories taught values and entertained during long winter evenings. Teenage years, ages 14 to marriage in early 20s, were a time of relative independence. Young people might work as servants in other households, earning wages and gaining experience. This gave them some autonomy while keeping them under adult supervision. Courtship began in these teenage years. Young people met at church, at festivals, during work in the fields. There was some opportunity for socializing and choosing partners, though always under community watchfulness. Marriage usually happened in the early 20s. By this point, a young person had learned their trade, gained some experience, and perhaps accumulated some resources. Marriage created a new household, and the cycle began again. Childhood mortality shaped society in profound ways. Multiple pregnancies were necessary to ensure some children survived. Women spent much of their adult lives pregnant or nursing. Family structures adapted to high child mortality and high birth rates. The lack of contraception meant limited family planning. Children came as they would. Large families were common, but so was high child mortality. A family might have 10 children born, with only 5 surviving to adulthood, orphans were relatively common. If both parents died, children might be taken in by relatives. If no family could help, older children might manage on their own or work as servants. Young children without family might not survive. Medieval society had no organized child welfare system. Disabled or chronically ill children faced particular hardship. Without modern medicine, conditions that are manageable today were fatal. A child born with significant disabilities likely wouldn't survive. Even minor issues like poor eyesight or hearing could severely limit life prospects. Despite all the hardships, medieval childhood had some advantages. Children grew up deeply embedded in community. They had extended family around them. They learned practical skills that gave them competence and confidence. They had responsibilities that made them feel valuable and needed. They also had freedoms modern children lack. Once they were old enough to be safe, children could roam relatively freely. They could play in fields and woods, swim in streams, explore their world. There was less structured oversight than modern children experience. Medieval childhood prepared children for medieval adulthood. It might seem harsh by our standards, but it was effective for its time and place. Children learned what they needed to survive and contribute to their society. Most, if they survived childhood, went on to become competent adults who carried on the traditions and skills of their parents. Now we come to perhaps the most surprising revelation about medieval peasant life. All the hardship, all the toil, all the restrictions we've discussed, these weren't the whole story. Medieval peasants were not simply downtrodden victims of an oppressive system. Recent historical research has revealed something remarkable. Peasants had far more agency and autonomy than we previously believed. They negotiated with their lords. They organized collectively. They resisted when pushed too far. The medieval village was not just a place of exploitation, but also a community of mutual support and shared governance. Consider this. The medieval calendar had about 100 holy days when work was forbidden. Add in Sundays, and peasants actually worked fewer days per year than modern people with their 40-hour work weeks and 2 weeks of vacation. Yes, their work days were longer and more physically demanding, but they had significant time for rest, celebration, and community. Or consider this: archaeological evidence of peasant houses shows they were better built and more comfortable than once thought. Peasants had possessions, belongings they valued and passed down. They had art and beauty in their lives, even if simple and humble. Perhaps most surprising, recent skeletal analysis shows that many medieval peasants were actually healthier than people in some later periods. Their diet, while monotonous, was often adequate. Their physical labor kept them fit. Some lived into their 60s and 70s, a respectable age even today. The image of the medieval peasant as a miserable, oppressed wretch is largely a creation of later centuries. The reality was more complex. Yes, life was hard, opportunities were limited, and the system was unjust. But within that system, peasants created lives of meaning, community, and even moments of joy. They loved and were loved. They laughed and celebrated. They took pride in their work and their community. They passed on knowledge and traditions. They lived full human lives, not so different in their essential humanity from our own, despite the vast differences in material circumstances. As we come to the end of our journey into medieval peasant life, it's worth reflecting on what we can learn from these people who lived so long ago. Medieval peasants built the foundation of European civilization. They cleared forests, drained swamps, built villages and towns. Their labor sustained the entire medieval social structure. Knights, priests, nobles, all depended on peasant productivity, but more than that, peasants created and maintained culture. Folk traditions, songs, stories, festivals, these came from peasant communities. Many of our holidays, our folklore, our sense of the rhythms of the year, these have roots in peasant culture. Perhaps most importantly, medieval peasants demonstrated human resilience. They endured hardships we can barely imagine. They lost children, faced hunger, endured exploitation. Yet they persevered. They found joy where they could. They built communities that supported and sustained each other. We are, in many ways, their descendants. The basic patterns of rural life they established persisted for centuries, only really changing with industrialization. When we visit Europe and see ancient villages, those are built on foundations laid by medieval peasants. Understanding their lives helps us appreciate our own. We have comforts and opportunities they couldn't imagine. But we can also learn from their deep connection to land and community, their resilience in the face of hardship, their ability to find meaning in daily work and life. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps spare a thought for those countless millions of medieval peasants who lived, worked, loved, and died, leaving little record, but shaping the world we inherited. Their lives mattered. Their struggles and triumphs are part of our shared human story. Thank you for listening. Rest well and good night.